The Hebrew Prophets, a Jewish Perspective, Jewish Study Series, by David Ben Yosef. In my final paper, I will explore the concept of prophecy. In Judaism, is defined by two great figures of Jewish history, Moses Maimonides and Abraham Joshua Heschel, are both influential scholars who have impacted the various streams of Judaism. A simplistic dichotomy could be made between their two perspectives, labeling Maimonides as a rational philosopher and Heschel as a mystical one. The study of Jewish prophecy and the approaches of the two scholars are already complex topics, but we must also address the nature of revelation. To some scholars, Maimonides' and Heschel's perspectives of God seem to be in conflict. One view is considered Aristotelian, while the other is seen as a traditional philosophy in line with the Bible and the Talmud. With these factors in mind, and based on the available data, my paper will support the following contention. Maimonides' and Heschel's different philosophical approaches about the biblical prophets are both within the bounds of classical Judaism. My paper will show that these sages are speaking of the same God of Israel as revealed in the Hebrew Scriptures and Jewish tradition, but from their unique perspectives. The merit of my premise will be demonstrated by reviewing the writings of both of these scholars, such as The Guide and The Prophets. The evaluations of other scholars will also shed light to the multifaceted character of these Torah masters and will aid in examining their perspective on the Israelite prophets. According to the biblical narrative, the mysterious characters known as the prophets bridge the gap between the immanent and transcendent aspects of God. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, the prophets appear as messengers and guides who exhibit a strong temperament and righteous behavior. In one way or another, the various prophets did God's bidding and were involved in major events in the history of Israel. They are also described as warning the masses about God's imminent punishment when they rebelled against his decrees. The first patriarch fulfilled this role, as Abraham is portrayed as an advocate on behalf of both the righteous and the wicked. Quote, "Since he is a prophet, he will intercede for you to save your life." Genesis 20:7. As Jewish mysticism developed, the role of these oracles of God became more defined. The Encyclopedia Judaica describes how the protagonists of the prophetic books challenged their fellow Israelites through their visionary utterances. The institution of prophecy is founded on the basic premise that God does not abandon humans to their own devices, but provides them with divine guidance. In biblical theory, the prophet does not choose his profession, but is chosen, often against his own will, to convey the work of God to his people, regardless of whether or not they wish to hear it. Ezekiel 3:11. Chapter 2. Definition of Biblical Prophecy. The scholarly definition of prophecy is influenced by research done in the last century. By the 1920s and 30s, after collecting data and oracles, meditation, and shamanism, scholars considered the category of revelatory religion to be the exclusive domain of the Semites. As we study the role of prophecy in Judaism, we must keep in mind the following two types of Jewish thought, as expressed by Heschel. One perspective may be called rational, historical, realistic, stressing the correctness of things, human values, natural order. The other perspective, which may be called prophetic or apocalyptic, looks at the world from the point of view of heaven. Its concern is with supernatural events, the miraculous, the indescribable, and the paradoxical. Maimonides exhibited a holistic approach to Judaism that considered all knowledge revelatory as it draws us closer to the divine. He also perceived revelation as divine speech and human reality rolled into one. Regarding the importance of revelation in Jewish prophecy, we must consider Heschel's particular perspective as well. He believes that revelation is dynamic and that humans have the intellectual ability to engage with the historical God. He espouses the traditional notion that the Talmudic sages possess the ability to prophesy just like their ancestors. However, This is an organic process. Just as the Holy Blessed One allowed prophets some autonomous space so that they become partners in prophecy, so did God allow the sages an autonomous domain in which they could apply the rules of exegesis. Heschel also considered the act of revelation to include both prophetic and apocalyptic aspects, which are self-inclusive or at times conflictive concepts. Chapter 3. Two Jewish Perspectives on God. To understand prophecy, we must turn to a comparison between the historic and the cosmic God. Biblical scholar David Hartman follows this trend, contrasting the, quote, God of the philosophers with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, end quote. One is perceived as nurturing, and the other oblivious to the fate of man, which compels us to create an unnecessary dichotomy. These different approaches affect our view of the ancient prophets. For example, Maimonides wrote the following: "It is one of the basic principles of religion that God inspires men with the prophecy gift. But the spirit of prophecy only rests upon the wise man, who is distinguished by great wisdom, but who by his rational faculty always has his passions under control, and possesses a broad and sedate mind." According to Professor Edward Brewer, Maimonides believed that prophecy is not helpful in the interpretation of the Torah. To him, the sages did not see prophecy as a way to resolve issues discussed in Jewish sources. Maimonides expresses a traditional perspective about the revelation of Sinai. However, he elucidates this ancient wisdom through a radical exposition. He finds creative ways to understand medieval Judaism using the prism of Greek philosophy. This allowed him to depict prophecy as the Jewish way to obtain truth and knowledge, which are both goals of the philosopher. To Maimonides, the prophet achieved intellectual perfection only after much training and learning. Although the potential for prophecy rests within individuals with an instinctive imagination, both moral and rational qualities are crucial to their role as a prophet. In his view, prophecy consists of an overflow from God as part of the imaginative faculty. Maimonides also finds a philosophy of Judaism within the concepts of election and revelation as interpreted in the Hebrew Bible, which describe God as involved in human affairs. He saw God as someone who is engaged with his creation. However, his, quote, theory of accommodation and his model of God as educator, including biblical descriptions of divine actions in history, need not be understood as miraculous ruptures in natural order, end quote. One of Maimonides' most contentious claims is his description of the mystical, quote, account of the chariot, end quote, as part of divine science and relating the concept of creation to physical science. His radical and profound reinterpretation of Judaism came about due to his desire to portray Judaism in a positive light in relation to other major world religions, particularly Christianity. In contrast, Heschel contends that the prophet experiences not merely the presence or the love of God, but a revelation of the divine pathos. In contrast, Heschel contends that the prophet experiences not merely the presence or the love of God, but a revelation of the, quote, divine pathos, end quote. The prophetic experience is divinely inspired, but it is affected by the cultural background and the personality of the prophet nevertheless. The uniqueness of Heschel's perspective is that he considered the prophets, rabbis, and Kabbalists to be part of the same continuum of the Jewish experience. To him, prophecy is both experiential and intellectual, quote, which does not directly come from God. It occurs, rather, through cosmic hierarchies, both ancient and Neoplatonic, or Kabbalistic, mediated by natural and human elements. According to Heschel's book, The Prophets, the ancient Israelite individual endowed with a prophetic gift suffered from a, quote, intense indignation, end quote. That individual often fought against national pride, which at times was more important than moral justice, since, quote, the spiritual without the political is blind, the political without the spiritual is deaf, end quote. Heschel believes that prophecy illuminates the future while discussing the present fate of man. The prophet is more than an oracle of God. He is an active revelator and representative of the divine will. According to Alan Brill, Heschel's view of biblical prophecy is different from other forms of mystical encounters with God. It is both non-ecstatic and interested in communicating a religious morality. In his writings, Heschel cannot find words to describe how magnificent and life-impacting prophecy is. In contrast with Maimonides' perspective, Heschel understands the, quote, Masa Merkava, end quote, as describing spirituality, not philosophy. In the article, Pathos and Prophecy, Susanna Heschel quotes her father's description of pathos as, quote, the central category of the prophetic understanding of God, end quote. The academic consensus is that the prophets, sages, Kabbalists, and Hasidim are all contradictory in their findings and religious conclusions, as much of the conflict lies in the relation to Hakalacha and Agada. However, Heschel creates cohesion among these two concepts, which is also something Maimonides does in his Responsum. Reuven Kemmelman believes that much of Heschel's work, quote, seeks to free Jewish theology from the constraints of Maimonides' philosophical concept of an absolutely transcendent God who is independent of humanity. To this, Heschel contraposes the concept of divine pathos, that is, of a God who searches for man, who indeed is in need of man. It emphasizes the interdependency of the divine and the human. End quote. Chapter 4. Reconciling the different views of God through the prophetic. Maimonides' view of prophecy entails moral and spiritual perfection, and some scholars claim that the Rambam, Maimonides' nickname in Jewish tradition, aspired to be a prophet himself. In his book Maimonides, Heschel describes the 13th century philosopher not as a cold rationalist, but as a holistic scholar who integrated law, philosophy, religious exhortation, and agadic wisdom. To him, the attributes of the prophets relate to Aristotelian views of human excellence, such as economic security, physical and moral perfection, virtuous behavior, as well as achieving intellectual preeminence. Maimonides connected spiritual knowledge to the imaginative quality of the soul, which comes directly from Aristotelian philosophy. Although it might appear that he is speaking of concepts outside of Jewish tradition, we can identify authentic Jewish thinking in Maimonides' conceptual understanding. Many Jewish scholars believe that he combines two incompatible ways of thinking. Nevertheless, his radical interpretation integrates prophetic mysticism and universal philosophical principles. The Rambam considered Jewish tradition as part of man's search for truth. At the same time, we must look at how Maimonides did not conceal his belief in the possibility of singular individuals achieving spiritual excellence through intellectual love of God, independent of the community of Israel, and the framework of halakha. His focus is the telos, which can be described as the personal search for spiritual truth as part of the quest for a universal ethic and civility.